You're watching Bloomberg Law. I'm Pacchia. When national economies experience real turbulence, it's only natural to expect some sort of government intervention into the private sector. We've seen numerous examples of this in recent years, and after the federal government's role in the automakers' bankruptcies, the mortgage fraud settlement, and other episodes, one would think that we've learned a thing or two and improvements could be made to this system. In that vein, the Financial Services Committee in the House of Representatives just held a hearing on what can be done to further protect the interests of investors in the event of government intervention. My guest today testified at that hearing. Joining me now is Stephen Lubben. He is a professor at Seton University School of Law. He's also a writer at the New York Times Dealbook, and of course, the fantastic bankruptcy blog Credit Slips. Had to get that in there. Big fan of your work over there.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for coming in. We'll get to Congress's priorities in a minute, but I have to ask, do you expect Congress to act here?
Well, I mean, these are pretty distinct issues that were covered in this hearing, so my suspicion is that at least a big motivation here is just to highlight that these three incidents happened and to remind people of them, especially prior to the November election.
Well, why now? I mean, is that we want to talk about the bailouts right now as to kind of maybe get at the Obama administration, the foreclosure settlement, but also Argentina got pulled into this. That happened in 2001.
Argentina happened in 2001, although the Justice Department has intervened in the litigation recently. So that made it, I think, fair game to be sort of thrown in. But it is kind of a hodgepodge of issues, and I think you have to at least assume that a decent part of it was political theater, just to remind people that this is an administration that is perhaps unlike the people who are in charge of the House.
But, I mean, it's a big topic. I mean, government interventions are messy. They're not exactly scripted. There's no playbook for how the government should kind of wade into the private sector in moments of panic. So I would imagine there are things that could be done better. That said, is focusing on investor protections the right inquiry for Congress to make?
Well, it depends on which of these topics we're talking about. And even in some of them, like, say, the mortgage settlement, the issue is not so much investor protection, it seems to me, but which investor did the administration favor versus other investors, because there the tension is really between the interests of the big banks and the interests of mortgage-backed security investors.
There was a fair amount of discussion over the notion that government involvement in the Argentinian situation disadvantaged investors during the 2001 Argentina crisis. For our viewers who may not be familiar with the story, what happened there?
Well, basically, Argentina didn't pay its debt when it became due in 2001. It then proposed a restructuring deal, basically a workout. And some investors took the deal, some of them didn't. The ones who didn't take the deal then decided to pursue a litigation strategy in court. It's a little tricky, though, because Argentina is a sovereign country. And unlike in the past, it doesn't appear as though we're going to send down the battleships to try to get them to pay.
Sure.
So it's basically looking around for Argentinian assets you can grab and trying to recover on those and hoping that you get a better recovery than you got through or could have gotten through the reorganization plan. And what has happened now is we've now reached the state where there's an appeal to the Second Circuit. And the government intervention in this specific case that they were complaining about involved filing an amicus brief, basically telling the Court of Appeals that the government thinks that the district court got it wrong and that the bondholders shouldn't have won.
So what's the complaint? What should the government have been doing to protect investors from speculating on Argentinian debt 10 years ago?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is that, right? And obviously these people who are decided, first of all, to invest in Argentinian debt, second of all, to forego the reorganization and, go it alone with this litigation strategy, these are not unsophisticated investors. They kind of knew what they were getting into. The bigger issue is, should the U.S. government be a little more forceful on their side versus, well, as they're putting it, taking the side of the Argentinians? I think the U.S. government would say that they are not taking the side of Argentina. Rather, they just want to preserve certain issues, such as sovereign immunity. If, for example, the U.S. government were to find itself litigating sovereign immunity in another jurisdiction, or alternatively, depending on how Europe plays out, it might become an issue of even further litigation down the road.
That's where I wanted to go next.
Right.
I found it peculiar that this is even on Congress's radar, particularly when it relates to sovereign debt. Is there anything instructive about this that could potentially give a clue as to how the United States government would deal with investors in the event of a European sovereign default?
Well, it certainly suggests that at least the State Department is really concerned about sovereign immunity. So if you have any ideas about, foreclosing on the Greek embassy or anything like that, it's not going to happen, right? I mean, that's essentially their issue in this litigation.
The panel also discussed the auto bankruptcies and the mortgage settlement. For the auto bankruptcies, there was a lot of criticism from commentators and pundits about how the government subverted the rights of secured creditors over in the interests of employees and retirees. You say they're wrong. You say that the government actually got it right. Why is that?
Well, there's actually kind of a twofold answer. First of all, take this specific example of Chrysler. The secured debt holders there got all the sale proceeds. That's all they're entitled to. The unions did get benefits outside of the plan. Most of those benefits were coming from the U.S. and Canadian governments after the sale happened. So, if you look at the total package, they did get a bigger recovery than the secured debt holders did, but the secured debt holders got all they were entitled to legally in the bankruptcy case. They had no entitlement to the side payments that the unions got too. I mean, the other issue too is just to keep in mind is that this whole notion that the absolute priority rule applies religiously in Chapter 11 cases just isn't right. I mean, it applies religiously in Chapter 7 cases, but this was not a Chapter 7 case. So you're always open to, negotiating a deal in Chapter 11. That's essentially what happened here. We had a syndicated loan agreement. 90% of the holders decided to go along with the deal. We had some holdouts who didn't like the deal. They complained that, some heavy pressure was put on that 90%. But it's not clear to me that that pressure was more than we might have expected, say, another secured lender who was driving the deal who wasn't the U.S. government to do. What
were some of the reactions from members of Congress as this panel unfolded and in the immediate aftermath? I mean, is there a general consensus that more needs to be done to protect investors from government intervention, or?
Well, it depended which side of the room you looked at. The majority, to varying degrees, depending on the particular members, seemed to be, thinking that this showed a general trend here among the administration of intervening in the affairs of private investors. The Democrats, on the other hand, generally called this, they didn't quite go so far as to call it a stunt, but they got pretty close.
We're living in remarkable times, and there has been an increased incidence of episodes where the government needs to step in to the private sector and throw its weight around, so to speak. Taking this conversation out to 35,000 feet, what grade would you give the government for the way they've handled themselves over the last 5 years? I mean, we're living in pretty choppy times.
Yeah, and some of the issues like Argentina doesn't really seem to belong in this category, right? Because that's old news to some degree, and the intervention that happened here was, as far as I can tell, pretty much the same as the intervention that happened under prior administrations. The other issues, it's on these two specific issues, I think the government did a reasonably good job, although I do...
You mean the automakers and the mortgage
the mortgages
settlement?
The mortgages I'm a little less enthused about because I do think...
not many people are thrilled with that deal.
Yeah, I would suspect that short of the too big to fail banks, nobody really would be too thrilled with that deal.
Sure.
Adam Levinson, who was also testifying at the hearing, did say that it kind of suggested that the administration, and particularly the Treasury Department, is still a little bit too fond of Chase and Bank of America, and there is something to that. I do think the whole package does seem to be mostly tilting in their favor. On the auto industry case, I think they did a pretty good job. Basically, doing the deal as close to a private deal as you possibly could, given the circumstances where no debt financing was available at that particular moment in time.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you have to go back and take a look at the fact that the economy is still standing. We haven't seen any substantial disruption of day-to-day life as a result. I mean, certainly one of these things could have led to a lot more disruption.
Yeah, and you might well have seen, especially in the Midwest where they're a little more reliant on the auto industry, you might well have seen unemployment rates that approach those that we saw in the 1930s, which would have been a pretty terrible thing.
Yeah, scary stuff. Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming in today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. That's Professor Steve Lubben from Seton Hall Law School. If you'd like to learn more about the cases and issues we just discussed, be sure to check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. You can follow our updates on Twitter and see more of our videos on YouTube. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.